All right, welcome everyone to our webinar today. The topic is demand forecasting in the new Dynamics AX, or version 7. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Lingsack, who's one of our senior application consultants. Before we go into the topic, just a little bit about who eBECS is and what we do and what we specialize in. So eBECS, we pride ourselves in being a total Microsoft Business Solutions provider. We have 3 core competencies: CRM, ERP, and BI, and we deliver solutions that are a mixture of those for companies globally. We also offer the private and public Azure cloud, and we have a managed services team behind all of our EFforts. It's I just want to make sure that you're aware of all of our Microsoft credentials. We are certified as BI, ERP, CRM Cloud, and CRM Cloud. And we win a lot of awards. We've won Reseller of the Year for the past 5 years, and we're very proud of our 2013 Global Partner of the Year. We've been Inner Circle for a long time, and I just mentioned that because it's awarded to only the top 2% of partners worldwide, and it really speaks to our industry knowledge and the way that we, and our Microsoft relationships. So for example, Mike Ehrenberg is our partner advisor, and he's in charge of all of Dynamics AX. So we really get insider info, and we can use our customers' case studies and stories to feed back to the product. So it's a healthy ecosystem, and we're proud of that. So next up is just a little bit about Andrew and how to moderate for this webinar. So if you have questions, please use the question feature of GoToWebinar. We will open it up at the very end and try and unmute you, but it's really hard to have everyone unmuted just from a speaker point of view. So if you use the question section of GoToWebinar, we'll address those as they come. And other than that, I'll hand it over to Andrew. He'll give a little bit of an intro to who he is, and we'll get into the topic.
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. Also, just wanted to mention, as Charlotte was kind of going over their credentials, we also recently won the Microsoft Country Partner of the Year award in the UK, which is really huge for us, and that was a great honor. So now a little bit about myself. Charlotte already mentioned I'm a senior application consultant here for eBECS North America. I've been with the company for about 1.5 years, but my overall experience in Dynamics AX is about 8 or 9 years. I started off as an end user for a worldwide manufacturing and distribution company doing inventory control, production planning, a lean apprentice, which is actually how I got introduced to eBECS. I implemented eBECS's lean module for my company as an end user all the way back in AX 4.0. So I have experience in AX 3.0, 4.0, 2009, 2012, and I'm now beginning to start the journey with the new AX. After being an end user, I became a business analyst for that worldwide organization before moving to the partner side and kind of transitioning to the role I do now, which is mainly a consultant in trade and logistics, supply chain, production, and master planning, which really gets in today's topic of demand forecasting. So here's our agenda. Some of this might be rehashed for those of you who have attended any of our previous webinars on demand forecasting, or perhaps the webinar I gave for the AXUG group maybe last month on demand forecasting. So some of this is going to be a little bit of rehash of that R3 stuff, and most of it's going to be new for AX7. So we'll start off with an introduction into AX demand forecasting and what it is. We'll discuss the new features that are in the new Dynamics AX, what's changed since 2012 R3. We'll walk through the forecast models and APIs that are available in this solution. Discuss some major themes. By that, I really mean the advantages. Why use this out-of-the-box system rather than leverage a third-party add-on or ISV solution. Then getting to the generation and authorizing the forecast for use in your planning processes, as well as a demo. So through the demo, we'll walk through some of the setup, we'll generate a forecast and actually authorize it for use so you guys can see how that plays into the planning processes. And then at the end, we'll pass it back to Charlotte to discuss any next steps and review your guys' questions that you may have. So first off, a quick introduction in demand forecasting. Here, we're mainly going to focus on statistical forecasting. So in early versions of AX, you never had the ability to generate a statistical forecast. You had the ability to apply a forecast that was generated elsewhere. Now in AX 2012 R3 and here in the new AX, we have the ability to generate a statistical forecast. In AX7, as I'll refer to it, it uses Azure machine learning to do this. So if you're using AX 2012 R3 right now, you know that you're using the cubes, you're using SQL Server analysis services, and the data mining models that are available there to generate your forecast. With AX7, we have a shift to Azure Machine Learning, which is really huge because Azure Machine Learning, or machine learning in general, actually gets better with the more data you collect. It's surveying large amounts of data and it's searching for patterns and trends. If you think in the short term, let's say you're really trying to forecast the next year, you don't have much data because you just implemented AX, it's going to be really hard to get patterns or trends, and if you do have them, they might not be relevant. So as the data continues to add up, those predictions basically learn from themselves, and you start to get a lot better data and you get smarter applications, in this case for demand forecasting, but it could have many other applications as well. Once the machine learning is used to review that historical data, it generates a statistical baseline forecast based on that. So one of the fears that I just mentioned, maybe you're new to AX, maybe you just upgraded from a previous version or you migrated from a previous system and you don't have those historical transactions from demand in the AX database. That's okay because we can actually connect to multiple data sources. You can use Excel files or CSV files. We can link to AX 2012 or even AX 2009. So if you're using kind of like that data warehouse structure or you have another system, there are ways to use that historical data instead of migrating all of your transactions into the new AX to drive the forecast. When you generate a forecast, you're using a dynamic set of forecast dimensions. So by that, I typically mean things like storage dimensions or dimensions of your customers. So storage dimensions would be your site, your warehouse. Your other dimensions could be customers or customer groups. Really, whatever level of granularity you need a forecast at is available. And we can even include custom dimensions. So when we get in AX and we show you what dimensions are available, you'll see the set of options that are out of the box. However, it's very common companies will add custom dimensions. For example, if you're a local government, country, region, or state might not be granular enough for you. If you're a local government, you might need zip code or town and add those dimensions so you can actually forecast at that lowest level, and you could add those quite easily. It's very extensive and very simple to add some custom dimensions to this feature. We then have the ability to visualize any demand trends, confidence intervals, and manual adjustments to the forecast. So obviously it will create the forecast for you, but if you have some insider knowledge, maybe you know there's a big promotion coming up and you expect demand to actually bump up based off of last year's sales, you can make those manual adjustments to the forecasts and apply those to planning. After you have created, generated, reviewed, and adjusted the forecast, you then can authorize it for use to forecast master planning. And that's mainly because you want to control exactly when it starts driving planned supply. You might have to tweak your parameters. You might have to rerun forecasting. Perhaps you have one person generate the forecast for all item allocation keys, and then individual users will be importing their data. You kind of segregate those processes, so in case you have a segregation of duties or you just need the ability to review, you have that authorization feature as a second step before it affects your planning. Also have the ability to remove outlier transactions. So let's say you're commonly selling maybe an inventory good in maybe the hundreds per year, and one customer calls up and they order 2,000, and that's really a lifetime order or a one-time order for them. You really don't want to use that data to skew your forecast because it's not relevant and it's not going to repeat itself next year. So outlier removal allows us to take those transactions out of the historical data so they're not considered when it's generating a forecast for us. And then finally, we have the ability to measure forecast accuracy. So if you're using AX 2012, you know that you have mean absolute deviation and mean absolute percentage error, and we have some tools still available to measure that forecast accuracy here in the new AX as well. So what are some of the new features? What's changed? What is different from AX 2012 R3 since that tool was introduced then? The first one is kind of basic. Your item allocation keys and your forecast entry forms have been moved. So before you had to go to the inventory management, stock management module to access those. And here what Microsoft has done is made it a little bit easier to navigate maybe control security, and just have all the forms you're going to use for demand forecasting in one place. You don't have to switch between modules or save favorites amongst multiple modules. You have all of those setups and all of those forms in one place, and it just makes it a lot simpler and ease of use a lot easier on your end users. The user interface is now right in the client. So instead of generating data, pushing it out to the cube, viewing your historical forecast in Excel, making your adjustments, publishing that, and then re-importing it into AX, everything can now be done right in the client. You still have the ability to export to Excel just like any other grid page. So if you need to just kind of manage the data but not have it affect AX or create some of your own key performance indicators, whether that's manually or in conjunction with Power BI, you still do have the ability to do that. It's just we do not use Excel as the tool to manipulate and import the forecast anymore. Manual adjustments, because of that change, are now highlighted by values being in bold. So in Excel, you always saw this little red triangle icon, and you could hover over it and see what's changed. Now the values in the grid form will be bolded, as well as there's a forecast lines form that actually has a column showing you specifically what quantities, what values have been changed to, so you can tell right away if somebody's made an edit to the forecast, what it used to be. And then you have the comments feature, which I'll show during the demo, that users can add comments to if they are making those changes. The demand forecast is not used in master plan until it's authorized, so I kind of mentioned that in the last slide. Instead of doing the publishing to the cube and periodic import, we now have an authorization job that pushes the forecast into your forecast plan. This solution is considered much more scalable. And the reason that's important is there's no dedicated hardware. You're not having a third-party software. You're integrating and building kind of this long value mapping tool, and you really don't have to worry too much about processing. Through the Microsoft R&D team, what they've said is you have the ability to process up to 200 item allocation keys simultaneously. To me, that's kind of mind-blowing. I've really never had a client who's used that many. I'm sure there are plenty out there. But I typically don't have clients that have nearly that many item allocation keys. So if we're able to process that many and still run these processes efficiently and not have them drag on for a long time, that's huge in terms of performance. We can create custom algorithms easily, and ISVs can even publish their own on the Azure Marketplace. So users of 2012 R3 and what we'll show you when we get to the forecast models here in AX7 know that there was a limited set of models available. Maybe they're not in line with huge forecasting packages that have 20 or 30 forecast models that you can choose from and patterns. Well, ISVs can still publish their own, and you can go out to the Azure Marketplace and bring those into AX if the APIs aren't sufficient for you, as well as obviously creating your own and integrating those into AX as well. One more thing I did mention about the multiple data sources pulling from previous versions of AX or from other systems. The only thing you have to be wary of there, I would say, in terms of new features is your item names and things like your unit of measurement have to be consistent. So just because we can pull data from those other systems, there obviously has to be a consistent value amongst those items. Otherwise, something would get lost when we try to pull that data. So there might be a data cleansing activity you might have to do if you are using those as your data sources before you come over to, before you generate enough history in AX7 to solely concentrate there. So speaking of the forecast models or APIs, some have been added and some have been removed. Previously we had one called ARIMA, which is auto-regressive integrated moving average. That's a long-term Box-Jenkins method looking at long-term forecasting. That is still available. That was probably the most common used in 2012. However, auto-regressive cross-prediction is no longer available. That was a Microsoft-developed model used for short-term analysis, short-term forecasting. We're talking about days or weeks rather than forecasting out months or years. That's been removed. Now what Microsoft has done is added two more, ETS, exponential smoothing, which is a more industry standard model, as well as seasonal trend decomposition. Both of those have been added as models to use. And we also have more mixed models available. So you can see down in this screenshot, the second row there, the time series model, we have ARIMA, ETS, STL, but we can also combine them. So you can combine exponential smoothing and ARIMA. You can combine exponential smoothing and seasonal trend decomposition, or you can use all. All is good because a lot of times if companies haven't done statistical forecasting before, or they're just not sure in AX what's going to generate, all is kind of a safety net where it will help you select the best fit model and really prove as a starting ground before you start introducing, I guess, more specific or different types of trends into your forecasting. So what are the major themes? Why use this add-on tool or this out-of-the-box tool and not an add-on tool, not an ISV software? First reason is modularity or partitioning for making the complex seem simple. What I really mean by this is how configurable it is. We've talked about the forecast dimensions. We've talked about including transactions, and we'll get to that more in a minute. So it's really easy to use. It's really easy to configure and manipulate without having to rewrite code or rewrite an integration. It's all very well maintained modularly within AX. Then we have the reuse of the Microsoft stack. So obviously any user of AX knows we have the ability to sync up with Outlook, with Excel, with SharePoint. Here, when we're talking about the reuse of the MS stack, we're talking about mainly Azure Machine Learning and Cortana Analytics. So we're using Microsoft tools to integrate with other Microsoft tools, which makes it a really seamless and efficient system. And then finally, we have the reduction at any decoupling point. Really what I mean by that is whether we want to forecast independent or dependent demand, so your dimensions, what dimensions are you forecasting at, and what history to use. If you're forecasting sales for a finished good, you probably don't care about inventory scrap or transfer orders between warehouses. You probably really only care about customer sales order demand. Alternatively, if you're forecasting at a component level, you're probably interested in consumption on a bill of materials for a production order, or maybe you are concerned with inventory transactions or other transactions within the system. So we have the ability to assign those values and reduce the forecast at whatever level your company needs to. And then here we have the basic flow of demand forecasting process. First, the historical transaction data is collected, whether that be in AX7 as intended or we're reaching out to external data sources, then generates a forecast based on historical demand using Azure Machine Learning. You can then go to the form called Adjusted Demand Forecast, view it, make changes to it, decide if you want to go tweak your parameters and generate it again, and then finally, once you're ready, you authorize that forecast in Dynamics AX so that when your forecast and master plans runs, it's taken into consideration. And then finally, this is just kind of a disclaimer that Microsoft typically gives. It is designed to meet the core functionality of a forecasting system. 2012 R3 was their first introduction into demand forecasting, specifically had the manufacturing industry in mind when this was created, and it can be easily extended, but it might not be the overall best fit for a retail wholesale distribution or professional services industry if you're already using a larger forecasting package. However, in my experience, we have been able to extend this to companies in all industries. It really just depends on what your requirements are, since it is easily extended and can be customized quite heavily. Here's just a snapshot of that process flow diagram we looked at. We generate the statistical baseline forecast with a set of parameters, looking at our historical horizon, having our baseline forecast date, filtering out any records that we don't need to, and so on. We then get a snapshot down here of our adjusted demand forecast, what those values are. And there's two buttons here that are grayed out that we'll look at in the demo where you can dive in and really dig into the details of those forecasts. And then once you're ready, you authorize that forecast for use with a general set of parameters on dates and seeing the details of the demand forecast that was generated. So now we'll just really jump right into AX and walk through a lot of this. So if you're new to the new Microsoft AX, if you haven't seen Dynamics AX before in this V7 version, it is a browser-based solution. And you can see here my main workspaces. There is a workspace for master planning, however, there's not a specific workspace for demand forecasting. So if I were to use this master planning workspace, all you really see here is kind of your standard planned orders and some inquiries and reports around there. So not really useful for today's demonstration. So here you would really need to use your navigation pane and go to your modules to find the demand forecasting piece in master planning. So we can see we have our forecasting setup, or our forecasting run and our forecasting setup in here. And I did mention earlier that we had moved, or Microsoft had moved certain features into master planning rather than into inventory management. So what you'll see if I click on the setup under demand forecasting, here are the item allocation key setup page, and here's the outlier removal, period allocation categories, and so on. Item allocation key is just a quick note about that. I'll get to the parameters in a minute where we'll talk about these in detail, but an item must be in an item allocation key if you're going to use demand forecasting. So item allocation keys have been in and around AX for a very long time, but with the introduction of demand forecasting, they kind of take a different approach with them. Instead of using this navigation pane, I'm actually just going to show you one of the new features of AX7, which is an enhanced search page. If I were to type in demand forecast, and I don't really know what module I'm going to, immediately it's going to bring up every page or form in AX that has the words demand and forecast in it. So I can see, I can get to my demand forecast lines, I can get to my parameters, I could look at other processes and find exactly what I'm looking for. So here, the first thing I really want to show you guys is the setup of demand forecasting. So I'll click on the demand forecasting parameters. First thing to note is this demand forecast unit. Every item that's going to be in your demand forecast is basically going to be forecasted in this unit. And that's really done so that if you're forecasting many items at once and you have multiple units of measure, your forecast will make sense. So if you have items that aren't in this unit, then you just need to make sure you have a unit conversion record. So if you have some items in units of length and some items in units of eaches or some items in units of weight, you want to have a singular unit that has conversions with them so that when you generate the forecast, it makes a little bit more sense. And obviously, if you have a bunch of different units of conversion, you might want to split those items up by item allocation key, for example. You then have the ability to decide what transaction types are included. So I mentioned independent versus dependent demand, or forecasting your finished goods versus forecasting your components. Here's where we decide what transactions will be considered. So my finished goods typically will always be sales order demand. I might have other transactions included. I might not. I would say it's rare that you would see something like quotations or transfers used, but you might use those on components. Kanban job and issues and production lines typically used on components. And this can all be overridden by item allocation key, which you'll see in a minute. Next, we decide what the forecast generation strategy is for your company. So are we using Azure Machine Learning? Are we using the tool to generate a statistical forecast? Or are we doing a straight copy over historical demand? So if you don't really need statistical analysis, all you want to do is take the previous forecast data and drop it into the forecast for the next forecast, use copy over historical demand, and then you can still manually adjust the forecast if you know that you're going to have an increase or decrease of demand in that new time bucket. Obviously, we want to use Azure Machine Learning to show the full power of the tool. And then we have all these parameters, which I'll get to in a minute. I'll actually go to the default page to show you what these mean and where these are set up from. Next, we have our forecast dimensions. So this is what I was referring to when we set up how granular of a level your forecast will be at. By default, you can see here it will always be per company, per site, and per item allocation key. So that's really the highest level you can go. If you're going to aggregate everything and you're really not pushing it down to the item level or warehouse, you just need to see a forecast at company, site, and item allocation key level. You can remove these dimensions and forecast at that level. However, most companies, they're forecasting items, and a lot of companies forecasting by warehouse as well, so they can see the demand from where that order was shipped from. And you can add inventory status, customer group, customer account, country, region, or state, and then you could also add custom dimensions to your forecast as well. The item allocation key setup, very similar to what's in 2012 R3. This is where you override those general settings. So if you have one item allocation key that's full of finished goods, one item allocation key that's full of components, or you have different product lines that have completely different trends. Maybe some are seasonal, maybe some are not. You'd want to split those up by item allocation key and set the parameters that really reflect that product grouping. So you can see here for the D allocation group, I have sales order, production line, and transaction on, and I'm using all of my Azure machine learning algorithm parameters. However, for the L products, it's set up for all transactions, and the parameters aren't applied. And then even for T products, all I'm doing is a straight copy over historical demand for the sales order demand. So I am not doing any analysis in that aspect. I'm just saying take whatever last year's historical demand was and apply it to this new forecast. And then finally, we have the setup to the Azure Machine Learning Connection parameters. So if you're using an AX7 test database, or once you start using AX7, you'll have to set this up so that it reaches out to Azure Machine Learning and is able to generate the forecast. This is similar to when you defined the Excel file and the cubes that you were using in 2012 R3. Now we're defining the web service API key, the endpoint address, and any custom storage account that the Azure Machine Learning will be done in. So next I'll just quickly jump over to our forecasting algorithm parameters that I mentioned. So out of the box we have, let's see, 7 different parameters. I think there was about 10 in the most extensive version of 2012. Some of those have been eliminated. We have the confidence level percentage. So if it's set to 95, obviously there's a 5% chance that my forecast could be outside of that confidence interval. The time series model is where you define what forecasting model you will use. So we can see all those here, the ARIMA, ETS, STL, and so on. I have our test system set up to all in order to select the best fit model. Since I'm unsure at this time what my trends or patterns are, I want the system to help me find that. The next 2 values, the maximum and minimum forecasted value, kind of help you smooth out the forecast. So if you don't want really huge orders to skew it too much, you can set a maximum forecasted value that regardless of the demand from that period, it will never generate a forecast over this amount. You can see mine's really, really high for the test system because I just want to see all the data. Then we have a minimum forecasted value, so same thing. One, in my mind, is probably not completely useful. Kind of ties in with this missing value substitution. So let's talk about the missing value substitution first to make sense of the minimum forecast value. The missing value substitution basically says if there's gaps in historical data, how do you want to fill in that gap? So if I forecasted based off of last year's demand, and in the month of April we had no demand, should I substitute that 0 quantity value with a specific numeric value? Should I leave it at 0? Or should I make it the mean? Should I make it the previous forecast buckets quantity, and so on? So if I had this set to 0, but my minimum forecast value was 1, anytime a 0 shows up in history, the forecast would generate planned supply for 1. And you can get into trouble there, especially if you have minimum order quantities, where it's going to say, well, your minimum forecasted value was 1 even though demand was 0, and you have a minimum order quantity of 500. So go and make or buy 500 even though you really had no demand in that bucket. So, you kind of need to align these settings together to make sure you're getting output that you actually want. If you set this to 0 and you have missing value substitution at 0, then you just won't get a forecast for that bucket that didn't have demand, which is a little more common than setting something to 1, because you really don't want to get planned supply for something you don't have demand for. We also have Seasonality Hint, so it provides a hint of the historical model to improve your forecast accuracy. So my setup is, as you'll see when I generate the forecast, is to be done in monthly buckets. So this one, basically, it's looking for forecasts or seasonality within those monthly buckets. If this was a 6, it would look for a trend over a 6 months time frame. And then obviously, if I was dealing with weeks, this number would correspond with a number of weeks rather than months. And then we have the test set size percentage of historical data to be used as a test set for forecast accuracy calculation as well.
So Drew,
Yes.
We've got a question from Daniel about, I think you mentioned it might not be the best fit for retail, and it might be a good time to just pause and give a little bit more info around your thought there.
Yeah, to be honest, it's not really my thought. It's kind of Microsoft's stand in the line. They put it on the white paper. They put it on all their material. Actually, those who developed this, they really had, as AX as an ERP program for Microsoft has really, in the past few years, been pushed towards the manufacturing industry, even though there's still tons of retail from obviously the origins of AX. The forecasting package was built specifically to keep manufacturing in mind. So even though it can generate plan supply for purchase orders, it was really designed to work to drive a production schedule. So that's why there are perhaps limited options around the number of forecasting models you have or the number of parameters you can tweak, whereas a lot of companies who are forecasting in retail or distribution have much larger complex forecasting packages. I wish I could go into more detail about that, but that's kind of just Microsoft's cue, I guess, on that. You still might be able to use it and fully function, but it is just kind of a disclaimer that we like to give in case you're not getting the results that you think you should. And I think that's mainly tied into how MRP and master planning works in AX and all those parameters. Okay. So now we'll actually move to how do you generate a statistical baseline forecast. So we've looked at the parameters. You guys can see what my setups were. I talked about I'm going to be using monthly buckets. So if we generate the statistical baseline forecast, it's going to ask you first, what is your historical horizon? What data do you want to pull to generate this forecast off of? If I'm going to be forecasting out the next year, I probably want at least 6 months to a year's worth of data to base that off of. Taking a short sample size of the previous 3 months is not very useful if I'm forecasting for the next year, especially if I have seasonality. So I'm going to say I want to look at all of the history from 2015. And since we're in the middle of June right now, I'm going to start my forecast on 7/1. The records to include is how you can apply filters. So all of those parameters are actually company-wide. So there's the defaults, and there's the item allocation keys, and there's intercompany planning groups where you can override some of that. But if I'm generating a forecast and I'm only responsible for, in my demo system, company USMF, I might only want to actually go and generate the forecast for that those item allocation keys I'm responsible for, or that planning group I'm responsible for. So this allows you to filter that out, so you're only generating a forecast for whatever you're responsible for. Then we have the parameters of our forecast itself. So when my forecast is generated, what are the buckets I'm going to be forecasting in? Are they going to be days? Are they going to be weeks? Are they going to be months? And depending on what you apply to this setting, it could change when you can set your from date to. Since mine are months, this from date has to be the beginning of a month later than obviously the last date of the previous forecast. Your forecast horizon is how far out into the future you're looking at. So mine, I'm saying 12 months. I want a 12-month forecast. And then a freeze time fence. So here I'm saying the first 2 months of the forecast, I don't want anybody to edit those. Those are kind of set in stone. Once they're authorized for use, I really don't want anybody to manipulate that freeze time fence of 2 months. Very common in purchasing where you have, once you give a forecast to a vendor, they basically say, you can't change the first 2 months because we need to plan capacity and delivery around that. Anything out to the future, we have enough time to react to, but set a freeze time fence of X percentage of time so we can make sure that we stick to that schedule. You can transfer manual adjustments to the demand forecast. I already mentioned that you can adjust the forecast after it's been generated if you have some inside knowledge or you just aren't comfortable with the numbers that it came out with. So this allows us to apply those manual adjustments back into master planning. And then you just kind of have a comment form that will show up in the forecast. Mine is very basic. It's just telling everyone what I'm forecasting for the D, L, and T allocation key products. If I know I'm going to be manipulating the forecast because I have a big promotion coming up next year where I expect all sales of a certain item to go up, or a certain group of items to go up 20%, I might add that as in a note here, so after the forecast is generated and I change those numbers, people know why I did that. And then run in the background is really just setting up if you're running this on batch processing or if you're running it in real time. So for today, I'm just going to click OK and actually run this forecast in right away. And what we should see is this shouldn't take longer than a minute or two in this test system. Obviously, the more data you have, the more item allocation keys, the more history, it's going to take a lot longer. But what I've found is for this group of items in my testing, it usually hasn't been too much longer than maybe 60 to 90 seconds at the most. And then while that's running, if there's any other questions, Charlotte, just let me know. Okay, so there, took less than a minute this time. I immediately get an alert that says I have new messages. The first says the operation is completed, which is good, so I don't have necessarily any error there, and it's been created. If there was huge errors that prevented it from being created, maybe your Azure Machine Learning connection parameters were set wrong, which happened to me the very first time I used this before I was familiar with the technical side, it would tell you that error and where to go to look into the details of that error, and I'll actually show you that in a minute. Mine did have one small error that didn't prevent it from creating, but it said it's failed for some of the dimensions. So if I look at that, it looks like it's just against two items that happen to have configuration turned on to them. So something I'll need to look at for those two items that a forecast couldn't be generated for those. But what I should see is the forecast was generated for all of the other items in my item allocation keys. So to see that, we have the generate statistical baseline forecast. Once it's generated, it goes to the adjusted demand forecast. But very quickly, before I show you that, I want to show you this forecast generation history. This keeps an entire log of every time the statistical forecast was run. So if you have issues, like you have this message that pops up and you really need to figure out why, or the forecast didn't generate and you need to figure out why, it's going to tell you who ran it, when it was ran, what the parameters were, and then the tasks that it actually went through, which is really great for debugging, especially from a technical standpoint, because it will show you how many processes, how many records were processed for each task, the start and end time of each task, so you can see which process is taking time or killing your performance. So if we run through these ones, mine completed successfully, so we really just see everything kind of looks smoothly. However, I believe I have one that failed. If I can find it for you, I'll try my best. And what that will show you is we'll show you a log as to why it failed. Let's see if we can find one. If not, then I'll just kind of show you what it's intended to do. Here's one. So you can see this very last process, and I'm just going to change my view here for a second to turn off that message. There we go. This last process does not have a checkbox to completed, so the actual generation of the forecast failed in 3 seconds. If I click on that, anytime there's an error or something hasn't been completed, I get task details. And if I click that, it's going to actually point to the code and the detail log of what went wrong. So here it had to do with some invalid arguments, and this actually was tailored around some of my connection parameters on Azure Machine Learning being wrong. So you might need a technical guy to look into that to decode what that message means, but it is readily available right here in AX if you need it. So now
Drew, we've got several questions. I'm not sure if it's a good time to stop. You tell me.
We probably only have maybe 5 to 10 minutes more of the demo, so I think it's probably best to wait till the end if that's okay.
Okay. Yep, we'll do that.
Okay. So here's the forecast that was generated when I ran it. We can see all the values here. This is just showing me the forecast numbers at this time, so we know I started my forecast at 7.1 and I ran it out 12 months, so it goes all the way to 6.1. You can see that these two columns, it might be hard to see this in the demo, but they're gray rather than black values. That's because my freeze time fence that I set, because I don't want anybody to go into these values and change them. If I do change a value, let's say this item, let's say I know that this is actually wrong and should be rounded up to 340, you can immediately see these are bolded. So I know right away when I come into this form, somebody's changed this. So if you have that segregation of duties where maybe generation was done on a batch job automatically, that wasn't done manually by a user, but then somebody came in here and they edited the forecast, you can see that. Once you want to dive deeper into why it came up with these values and really see what has changed, you have your forecast line details. So this is similar to if you're using 2012 R3, you have the pivot table in Excel, you can add fields and remove fields and dive into the data. This is kind of what that's showing. So I selected that item, for example. It's showing me my historical demand based on that horizon I set, and it's showing me what the forecast was at that point in time as well. So I can do some analysis of past history and past transactions. And now it's showing me what my current forecast would be if I authorize this for use. I have my manual adjustments column, so I can see here that it was manually adjusted by 7. So I knew right away that this is 333. If I had decremented, it would be a negative quantity. And then we can see my confidence interval as well from this form. And then if we scroll down, that's where we get into some of our forecast accuracy. Our mean absolute percentage error of 81.94. It tells us what forecast model was used, and it has some very kind of basic graphing features to show us forecast versus historical demand over those time frames. So you have the ability to kind of, get whatever information you need to, like showing the accuracy. What is our errors, error percentage here? And then you can even change the historical horizon if you need to, that you use to generate the forecast. I'll quickly go back to my current demand forecast. You can see this is the form where your demand forecast is entered. So I haven't authorized it for use yet. This is old data previously to what I've done today. This is the form you would have seen in inventory management in the past, and now it's in master planning, as we can see. So what would happen if I take this adjusted demand forecast, straight from this form I can authorize it for use, or I can go back and use my navigation pane to run the periodic process. And I'm going to say authorize it for use, set the dates that I'm actually going to apply it to. So maybe I actually forecast a year out, but I'm only going to really apply it for the next 4 months. I could say only bring in the next 4 months, and I could change this. I can also decide which companies I'm authorizing for use. So in my mind, I'm a U.S. planner. I'm not going to manipulate or change or do anything to France and USRT. I'll remove those, and who's ever responsible for those can come and authorize their forecast for use later. Here I'm just going to import for company USMF. And if I scroll down, I actually see the parameters that were used the last time this forecast was run and who ran it. And then if I click OK, it should authorize this adjusted demand forecast and push it into that demand forecast lines form. So next time forecast plan and master planning runs, looks like maybe somebody else was trying to run it. It kind of gave me an error there saying that 2 records were being inserted at the same time. So I'll look into that error. Don't want to take time up in this demonstration, but once it's authorized for use, it will push it, like I said, into your demand forecast lines form. So if we look at manual forecast entry, it will authorize it into this form, and then this form is what's looked at when your master planning and your forecast planning run. And then before we get back to the slides, I guess maybe we want to open up to questions in case I have to show you here anything in AX. Charlotte, you still there?
Yep, I'm here. Do you want questions at this point?
Yeah, let's do questions now.
Okay. right, so the first one is there a way to evaluate or test a forecast by comparing to actuals, e.g. run a forecast for 2015 and then compare it to the actual 2015 values?
Yeah, so you can, when we looked at the adjusted demand forecast, one of the things that you'll see is you can run a forecast in the past because it will show you what the forecast was then, but it will also show you, if I select this one for example, it will also show you what the demand was then. So you can run a forecast for those past dates and compare your forecast to the demand if that's what you're asking. So this is all of 2015. This is the forecast that I had in place, and this was my actual demand. So you can see, you know, it was fairly close, but not quite 100% there. This month being one that's, these 2 months being two that stick out pretty greatly. The differences between my forecast and what actual transactions occurred.
Okay, great. The next one is all this data being pulled from the cloud?
No, it's not. It's being, the generation of the forecast being done through Azure Machine Learning, which is obviously a web process, but the data itself is your transactions in AX. So it's your actual sales order history in AX. The only thing that's really being done in Azure Machine Learning is the analysis of that data and the creation of the forecast. But all the data comes from your ERP system, or if you're using like a CSV file or Excel file.
Yeah, which in theory, I guess the version 7 is in the cloud, so
yeah.
it could be coming from the cloud. So, the next question is there a way to automatically adjust for promotional sales, i.e. if a widget was put on sale by the marketing department in October, can that automatically be factored in so that the boost in sales in that month isn't applied to the forecast?
You probably want to use outlier removals for that. I don't know about a way of automation, but within our demand forecasting, outlier removal is where we can exclude certain transactions. So if you had a specific sales order or a certain item that you don't want to include in the forecast, this outlier removal just uses, I'll just put one in here, probably something I should have shown. It just uses a standard AX query form. So it's actually looking at your inventory transaction tables where you could point to a reference like a sales order number, an item, a specific lot ID, and if you set that query, it just ignores that transaction completely for the forecast. Is that what you were asking?
I haven't heard back from him. He says yes, that's good. All right, great. And that was our last question.
Okay. So before I pass it back to Charlotte, I just wanted to mention, and she might even mention this herself, however, one of the things, if you guys want some further material on this, we have done a very brief summary blog on the changes between 2012 R3 and AX7 on our eBECS website blog, as well as we will have some upcoming MRP series blogs that focus on specific functions and specific features in master planning that people might be interested in. So make sure you keep a lookout for those as well. And I'll pass it back to Charlotte.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Andrew. I just want to mention some of our upcoming webinars. This is part of a series, this webinar right now, on the new Dynamics AX. Upcoming next week, we have one on a day in the life from order to ship. So we're going to go through just a day in the life of how you would run your business using AX version 7 from a high level. So please sign up on our website if you're interested in that one. We also have one coming up about data warehousing and the Azure Data Management Platform. So again, from a BI point of view, how you're going to, in the future, use the Azure Data Management Platform if you're interested in that. What's new in operations? We're going to be covering a lot of production, supply chain planning in that webinar. And then utilizing the new retail functionality that comes with, I think it was 2012 R3, but also version 7 for every business. So not just if you're a retail business, but if you're in any business, there's some great additional functionality that came. So we wanted to make sure you guys knew about our upcoming webinars. On top of that, we also have a couple things going on that we wanted to make you aware of. We have an AX7 masterclass coming up in July in our Atlanta office. It'll be a day just dedicated to our master, understanding what's coming with AX7 and starting to prepare you guys as our customers and customers on AX and prospects. We also have an upgrade proof of concept. So if you're sitting on 2009 or 2012 and you're looking to upgrade, we will come in and do a full proof of concept and give you a real feel for what it's going to take, both from a functionality gap fit point of view, but also a project planning and cloud assessment point of view. We are also having an offer on, and I'll explain that in just a second. You want to go ahead and switch for me, Andrew. We have an upgrade assessment that if you are running on 2009 or 2012 and you're interested in version 7, we have a quick and dirty 2-day on-site assessment that we're offering for a very discounted price of $2,500 right now. Again, where you're starting to understand the return on investment for cloud versus on-premise, a high-level understanding of what you might have from a customization point of view that we can eliminate with a new version of AX. You might have some ISVs that we need to consider, business intelligence, where can we leverage the new Power BI, what does it mean for your business, and then a high-level estimate of what it will take to get you on the new platform, and how we're going to utilize lifecycle services as part of all this. So it's very much an education, but with the intention of it being very quick and dirty to give you an initial feel for your business of how it's going to work. So if you're interested in any of this, our emails are on the next slide. You can always contact myself, which is cmccormick@ebecs.com. That says ebecs.com, but it's actually ebecs.com. And then, of course, Stephen Wilson in the UK at swilson@ebecs.com. So I will just check one more time if there are any questions. And let me get to the question pane. We'll hang out for probably another minute if you guys have questions. And otherwise, it was great having you all on the webinar. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to having you on some of the next version 7 series.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for attending today.
There are no questions as of yet, so you might get off the hook easy. I think we addressed several of them during the webinar. So.
Yeah.
All right, well, if you have further questions, please email myself, and we look forward to speaking with you further. Thanks, everyone, and thank you especially, Andrew.
Thanks, Charlotte.
All right, so